international community do not seem to be willing to acknowledge that their former ally is the cause of this war.
Do my best to inform the American public.
A genuinely horrific conflict, as people in Amhara have experienced particularly.
Because of the attacks of the Tigray People's Liberation Front.
Western people whose mismanagement of this conflict has made it worse.
Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch also typically defend the State Department position.
In the Amhara region, so in Welkite.
The Gondar region in Welkite.
And they need to get out of that prison because they're on the wrong side of reality.
Hello and welcome viewers. You are watching Amara Media Corporation. This is our weekly program named Messenger. In today's edition, I have brought you two guests. They are journalists and they have an experience of visiting around Ethiopia in connection to the current conflict around Amhara, Afar, and related to the Tigray situation, the TPLF situation with the government. So we do have some discussion with them. Stay with us, and my guests, welcome. Let me start from your introduction.
Okay, I'm Ann Garrison. I'm from the United States. I produce for the Pacifica Radio Network. I'm both a reporter and a producer, and I'm also a weekly contributor to the Black Agenda Report.
Okay, thank you.
My name's Alistair Thompson. I'm a journalist and editor and publisher from New Zealand. I publish on a publication called scoop.co.nz, which is a New Zealand politics, international relations publication. Yeah.
Welcome to Amara Media Corporation again.
Thank you.
And also, it is better to start as in three questions. I think you have conducted some research, you have observed around different areas in connection to the current conflict between the government of Ethiopia and TPLF. So you have your own thematic focus or study of area. What are your study of the area of study and why you have selected that area in order to conduct your research?
Well, I'm a lifelong critic of U.S. foreign policy, and as soon as this conflict began, it became clear that the U.S. government was lining up behind the TPLF, and we were constantly being told on the media that Tigrayans are the victims in this conflict, even that there's a genocide going on in Tigray, and that the U.S. is compelled to act in one way or another, either with sanctions or even at worst some sort of military action. And I think we have to keep in mind that the U.S. does have a military base in Djibouti. In December, it beefed up its force there with 1,000 more National Guardsmen. And last week, after the governmental change in Somalia, Joe Biden announced that he was reintroducing troops. He said 400. He said he would put a cap on that, but these caps aren't always adhered to. He said he's introducing another 450 troops into Somalia. And we have a Congressman, Brad Sherman, who is calling for the U.S. Navy to block the ports in Eritrea. We've been told over and over that the Tigrayans, the TPLF, are victims. I don't want to say that those are the same, that the TPLF and the Tigrayans are the same, but essentially in U.S. government policy they're identified, and we've been told that they're the victims and that the U.S. may have to act. There are two sanctions bills pending in U.S. Congress, one in the House, H.R. 6600, and one in the Senate, Senate Bill 3199. So I feel it's my responsibility to come and observe what's really going on here and do my best to inform the American public with the audience that I have, and that's particularly the grassroots American public, the social justice and peace communities in the United States.
Okay. What about Mr. Alastair? What is your study area and why you have selected?
My study area is broadly similar to Anne's in the sense that I think my motivation for beginning research on the conflict in Ethiopia is the same, essentially the role of the international community in it. And particularly, it's becoming very clear that the war is continuing because of the international community's response to it. It's failing to hold the TPLF to account. It's failing to address the misdeeds of public servants like Dr. Tedros Adhanom, and mistakes that were made in early phases of the war, and I mean needlessly prolonging a conflict which is horrific, a genuinely horrific conflict, as people in Amhara have experienced particularly. And I mean the reason for that thematic focus is the same as well. I mean, it is my people, it is the Western people whose mismanagement of this conflict has made it worse.
Okay. So you come to Ethiopia in order to make the situation clear for the international community. You are working to contribute in this regard. So in what ways you are conducting your research in order to reach on the genuine findings, the genuine outcomes?
I'm collecting content and conducting interviews and talking to people. I've collected quite a lot of video content and a lot of photographs. And I'm also making connections, collecting contacts for people that when I return to France, where I live, I will be able to continue research work into and producing. I mean, I think there's a lack of rounded coverage, which fully is based on a full understanding of the circumstances here and the history. Because the war began in a way which has been lied about. It was continued in a way that was lied about. The true story of this war hasn't been told, and so my objective is to go back and then try to do a better job of telling the truth about what's happened here.
Okay. What about the situation? How you make your study? What ways you are using in order to reach on your conclusion, your outcome?
I flew into Addis and I went straight to Lalibela. There I met Jamal Countess, a photographer who has been flying back and forth between the US and Ethiopia since the war began. We went north to Sokoto, where we visited refugee camps, people living in horrid conditions, IDP camps, internally displaced persons camps, not refugee camps. These are displaced Amhara people from the northernmost region on the border of Tigray. They said that they had fled because the TPLF took everything they had, and they finally had no choice but to flee. They needed everything that people in IDP camps need: water, food, medicine, sanitation. And I went to 3 camps there. Each was worse than the last. In one, in the first, some people seemed to have mattresses. I couldn't see any sanitation facilities. There may have been, but they were not apparent. People were cooking indoors. People looked miserable and lost. In the second one I went to, everyone was sleeping in one huge enclosure with a cement floor. There were no mattresses. Again, lack of food, water, sanitation, signs of desperation everywhere. And in the third, that was the worst. It was right on the edge of the town of Sokoto. And there were people and animals living together with next to no shelter, with nothing but perhaps tarps stretched over some poles. And very, very crowded and terrible, terrible unsanitary conditions. I then went on to visit an IDP camp on the A2 highway, where people had fled from the violence of the OLF as well. Then I returned to Addis after that. Alistair and I went to Afar together, and we saw IDP camps in Afar, and horrible suffering there. The threat of a measles outbreak waving through these IDP camps and overcrowded hospitals. Particularly vulnerable were children under the age of 5 who were already at risk because they were malnourished and didn't have enough clean water. So there's a real pending disaster there, and I have written as I've gone along all the way. I write every week for the Black Agenda Report, and I produce 1 or 2 radio reports for Pacifica Radio, and I've reported on what I've seen and made the point that the government, my government, keeps saying that all the suffering is in Tigray, and that what we have to worry about, what we are morally obliged to worry about, is Tigray. And I have said no, there's immense suffering in Amhara and Afar because of the attacks of the Tigray People's Liberation Front.
In your observation, in your interview, what stories you have, lesson, main things that touches your heart?
I went to Gondar and travelled up to the border areas in the north, close to the Tikizi River.
In the Amhara region.
in the Amhara region, so in Welkite. And I did so because of the Gondar University research study. And we visited Adi Salam, which is a village near to Gehenna, which is a prison complex which was used by the TPLF.
Gehenna means the prison area of the TPLF when it was in power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, it was almost before it was in power, so it was towards the end of the 1980s when they were there. And I spoke to a monk from Weldabar Monastery who told me of the experiences of the monks in that monastery, which was invaded 8 months ago, and in which large numbers of monks have been killed and are being tortured. We spoke to various witnesses from the area and veterans of the Kafang, which is sort of like a predecessor to the Whānau, who had fought the TPLF when they first basically arrived in Welkite across the river. And then also spoke to the researchers. I spoke to a prisoner, a Derg prisoner, who was imprisoned at Gehenna, and he described his experience of being in prison there and witnessing a very large number of people, basically briefly seeing them for a few days, and then they're being murdered. He thought, I mean, either being shot or perhaps thrown in the river if it was in the winter. And then travelled back to Addis, and then went to Afar. And in Afar, I was particularly interested to try to understand what had happened after December, so after the end of the war. And I was quite shocked to discover that the true story of what has happened in Afar is much worse than we had understood. We knew that the TPLF had attacked near Abala in December. So, I mean, they announced their withdrawal to Mekelle, but before they announced the withdrawal to Mekelle on around the 21st of December, they had already started fighting in Afar, and their objective there was to invade and to try and take Afdera. And they attacked the communities in Zone 2 across the border going north from Abala, and basically disrupted all of the people who were living in the towns and many of the people who were not living in the towns, and created about 1 million IDPs. Some of those IDPs are still in the north, and some of them are in the south, particularly women and children are in the south. And they're in a terrible state. And meanwhile, the international community was only really concerned with, and Dr. Tedros Adhanom was constantly complaining that there was no aid getting into Tigray during that period. But the reason there was no aid getting into Tigray was because the road was blocked, because they were in the process of invading down the road and trying to take Afdera. And the Afar militia fought them off, eventually pushed them back, and then eventually they left. There was a whole lot of misinformation too. I mean, there was a story which was told very widely in social media which said that and also reported by the Telegraph, where it was claimed that that there was in Abala, when Abala was taken, that there was some Tigrayans who had attacked the defenders of the town and then been killed, which apparently is just not true at all. I mean, basically, when the town was attacked, everybody left, and they all left together, and now they are. I mean, those IDPs are also in Samara. So, I mean, what I've discovered is the extent to which the information that we have about aspects of this war is very, very poor, and the extent to which, especially a lot of the news that we consume in social media, can just be wrong. And I mean, I think that's one of the problematic things here, and the injustice of IDPs in terrible circumstances in Afar, whilst their region is being used as the main primary corridor, and there is now a very large amount of aid going north into Tigray, but at the same time, UN agencies have been distributing whole grain to people who don't have any milling equipment and who can't grind that and can't really eat it. So there's a lot of problems here, and the resources are not being distributed in an equitable manner.
I made a point in the 2 reports that I produced this week of addressing the issue of the trucks going to Tigray, because this has just been a chant over and over and over. There are no trucks getting into Tigray because they're being blocked by Ethiopia and Eritrea. I don't know where they get this idea that Eritrea is blocking them, because there are no Eritrean soldiers in Afar. And I spoke to drivers of International Committee for the Red Cross convoys who had gone from Nairobi to Addis to Mekelle and back, and they were stopping to rest in Samara. They had gone into Mekelle unhindered. As Alistair said, he observed convoys going into Mekelle. I learned specifically, and this is from Alistair, that there are some checkpoints where the trucks are scanned to determine whether or not they might be carrying weapons that they shouldn't be carrying, whether or not they're carrying metal or electronic equipment. That's perfectly reasonable, this demand.
It is the area in which there is still conflict, so
yes,
everything should be checked.
Everything should be checked. This call for unhindered access is just ridiculous. This is the middle of a war. Of course, you can't have trucks carrying weapons into Tigray.
In connection to the destructions in Amhara and Afar side,
right?
When you compare it to situations in Tigray also, even there is a humanitarian need in Tigray, there is also a humanitarian need in Afar and Amhara,
right,
as you have observed. But when you see the international media, the international governments in US and some Europe countries, most of the time they have focused on the humanitarian access that should be brought to the people in Tigray. We know that, we understand that.
Yeah.
Humanitarian access should be given for the Tigrayan brothers.
Of course.
There should also be given in equitable manner for the people who are in suffering situation in Afar and Amhara. What do you say in this regard?
U.S. foreign policy has for a long time been characterized by policymakers' choice of what Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman called worthy and unworthy victims. And they have decided in this case that the Tigrayans are the worthy victims. And that this focus on the Tigrayans is supposed to shape U.S. foreign policy, and the point of stressing that constantly is to create consent for punishing the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments for what the U.S. government says they are guilty of, which is persecuting the people of Tigray. And this only works if you ignore the suffering in Afar and Amhara that was caused by the TPLF invasions of those regions.
My perspective on this at the moment is coloured by the fact that we have clear video evidence that TPLF is actively recruiting child soldiers again, and not just child soldiers, probably old people and just anybody that it can find, in order to conduct another invasion. Now, exactly where it's going to invade is not clear, but it looks as though there's going to be another attempt to try to take the Djibouti highway, and probably at Mele, Shifra, the places where the war was fought at the end of last year. And Debretsion has, I mean, he has openly stated that the peace process has failed and that they have no choice but to fight. And again, none of this is being reported in the international media, partly because the Ukraine war, but also partly because the international community do not seem to be willing to acknowledge that their former ally is the cause of this war. They were the cause of the war from the beginning, back when they attacked on November the 3rd and the 4th, and they have perpetuated this war ever since. And I think it's very difficult to understand how they could change that, roll that back. As Anne points out, it's quite possible that there's some, I don't know, extremely cynical reasons for their conduct. But at the same time, the simple weight of evidence ought to overcome that now. It's completely clear that another catastrophic war will go ahead unless the international community, particularly the United States, changes its position and seeks to try and pursue a path of peace. And the only way they can do that is to put pressure on the TPLF. The TPLF clearly think that they can act with impunity and that they will continue to enjoy the support of the United Nations and Europe and America and Great Britain for whatever they do, no matter how badly they behave, no matter how many people they murder, no matter how many people they rape, how much aid they steal. The situation here is desperately wrong.